Blazor In Action with Chris Sainty.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Before we start, I want to put out a personal message. For those of you who have followed my work and content for some time, you know that I started ClearMeasure 10 years ago. We're a software architecture company, and that's the type of consulting we do to help in-house teams be great, to jumpstart them along their way. So all of our work is programming in all of its various forms, and we've done a tremendous amount of DevOps and cloud automation work as well. And we're the North American consulting partner for Octopus Deploy. Now, I haven't done this very often, but I'm putting out a call for anyone who'd like to work with me. We've been running on a backlog of projects for quite a while now, and we need to grow. We need some more .NET software engineers, DevOps engineers who have Octopus Deploy experience and Microsoft Cloud experience. And we're also in need of a few more experienced software architects. And if you followed me for any length of time, you probably understand how I think about software. And if you like the way I think about it, then you'll absolutely love working with me at ClearMeasure. We need to hire some people pretty immediately. So if this has piqued your attention, please go ahead and apply online on the website. And if you have any questions, just send me an email at Jeffrey, Jeffrey, at clear-measure.com. And thank you for indulging me with the interruption. And here's our regularly scheduled episode. Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast, deliver quality, and run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software architecture company that empowers .NET teams to be self-sufficient and effective and delivering world-class software results. By using its ClearMeasure Way methodology, you can go to clearmeasure.com for information about them. And thank you for being a great supporter of the podcast. Also, a quick announcement, my architect forums are going strong. Signups for the next sessions are up. If you lead a software team and are looking to collaborate with peer architect leaders, it's free. It's just an open forum. We're having fun with those monthly conversations. Go ahead and sign up at the link in the show notes. And for those of you who are looking for the Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, just search in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. And on to our guest. I'm excited to welcome Chris Sainty to the show. Chris is a Microsoft MVP and author, a software engineer with over 17 years of experience, or going on 20, perhaps, with ASP.NET. He's passionate about sharing his knowledge with the community. He regularly writes both for his own blog as well as others, such as Visual Studio Magazine, Progress Telerik, and StackOverflow. And this passion for blogging has led to his first book, Blazor In Action, from Manning. And it's a practical guide to building Blazor applications. And he also maintains several popular open source projects under the GitHub organization Blazored. That's Blazord. And when not tapping on the keyboard, Chris is a keen speaker, having delivered talks at both user groups and conferences all over the world. And you can find Chris online with his blog, chrissainty.com. And we'll include a link to that in the show notes, as well as on Twitter at Chris_Sainty. So, Chris, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Yeah, I'm good, Jeffrey. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Long-time listener. So,
Awesome.
It's cool to be this side of the mic this time.
Oh, fantastic. And there's plenty of folks who've heard you speak at NDC, and you've done some videos, for some of the Microsoft, YouTube shows or whatnot from time to time. But take us back. How did you start working on Blazor or .NET? What got you into programming? What are the big points along your career that kind of shaped things and led you to what you're doing today?
Oh, cool. Right. Yeah. So let's go all the way back then. So I started my career at a small company who were on the Sandringham estate, which is an estate owned by the royal family over here in the UK. And I was building PCs because that's what you did back then. You know, you went to a small IT company, they built you custom PCs, and this was before Dell and all of that kind of stuff. So I was doing that, and they also did a few bits of custom software. So that was written in VB6. So it gives you an idea of how
we're in the
long ago
90s,
we're talking here.
mid 90s.
Yeah, late 90s. This is coming up to and things. So, and eventually, after doing PC building and networks and servers and all that kind of stuff for a while, the boss said, "Oh, I think it's time you get into a bit of programming." So I was like, "Okay, not really done any of this before, not really too sure about it." So I was like, "I'm up for the challenge. Let's go." And he said, "I'll never forget." He's like, "There's this new thing from Microsoft called .NET or something. Sounds like it's probably going to be, you know, pretty big. So thought you might want to try starting with that, because it's probably going to be the future of things." So this was about 2002. So really right at the very start of .NET. I think it was like either Framework 1 or 1.1 or something like that. And so VB.NET had a go building a web forms application, and then never looked back after that. It was kind of web-based applications for me on .NET going forward, and that's what I've been doing ever since. So yeah, fast forward a few years, I kind of went through the kind of traditional track, I guess. Really, I start junior engineer at companies, building out services and web-based applications. I moved from doing web forms into MVC, which felt like a huge modernization coming from web forms. Web forms never quite sat well with me. I loved it from a productivity standpoint. It was great. But it always felt like we were trying to make the web behave like a desktop application. And I really like web technologies. So it kind of felt like we were going against the grain with that. And
well,
then
back in that era, I mean, you had Adobe having complete 100% Flash websites where you're not even doing HTML. But so that was kind of the era where it was like, what's the web going to be?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it was a very interesting time for development. I remember, I'm going to get this out of the way early doors. I remember a company I was at around that time looking at Silverlight and being like, "Oh my God, this thing is, revolutionary." And they built a big Silverlight application, and then everyone was clamoring to be on that team because everyone wanted to use that technology and everything.
And the smartphone killed Silverlight, it killed Flash, and here we are.
Yeah, exactly. Then we have the Steve Jobs iPad issue with battery life and no more Silverlight or browser plugins from this point forward. So yeah, but I really embraced MVC. I liked it as a pattern, and I liked the framework. I think I came into MVC around MVC 3 because I think that was when MVC kind of got good in the .NET world. 1 and 2 were okay, but they were still getting there, I think. So yeah, so I did that for a long while, and then I kind of hopped over into kind of SPA-based development when that transition happened. So I started moving to building applications using APIs and then having an Angular front end or Angular JS front end at that point. And then the companies I was working for at that point, that we then transitioned to Angular when that had that change. So Angular 1 to Angular 2, or Framework A to entirely new Framework B that just happened to have the same name, however you want to look at it. And this is already good. And I really enjoyed all this mix of technologies and things. And I've never really had a problem with JavaScript and front-end development. I've always really enjoyed it, and it's always been fine. But I've always loved C# ever since I got into C# when I moved from VB. And it's always kind of felt, for me as a .NET developer, I've always felt almost that's slightly out of place because I love doing back-end development. It's great, but I really love front-end as well. And front-end development is definitely a smaller chunk of the .NET community. Like there's, it's something that I think a lot of .NET developers feel, oh, okay, well, I've got to build a front-end, but I'll do that as quickly as possible so I can get back to the back-end stuff, which I get. I totally understand that. And especially when you had to transition into front-end technologies like JavaScript, and then you have to deal with Node and NPM and all of that fun stuff and things. So there was always that missing chunk for me as a .NET developer. I couldn't quite ever do the full thing in the language I love, in the framework I love with C# and .NET and all this kind of thing. And then, I think it was 2017, end of 2017, I'm on YouTube and this video pops up from Steve Sarnason of a talk at NDC Oslo. And he's got this talk and it's got these 4 different points in it that he's talking about. And one of them is, I spent a few weekends playing around with this technology called WebAssembly. And by the way, I've got all of .NET running in the browser as a spa. Right. And I literally, my jaw just hit the floor. It was like something that just resonated with me immediately. It was like, this is the thing that I've been missing as a .NET developer. This is the missing piece of my puzzle. I can now use the thing I love everywhere. And my God, this is really exciting. So I immediately jumped straight over to GitHub to try and find the repo he used. And then from there, I'd found that they'd already created an experimental repo Microsoft had for it as a thing. So I'm like scouring the code base, looking over any issues I can find, trying to just understand what's going on. And then I started sort of trying to build it from the source because I was like, I just wanted to play around with it. And then luckily for me, about a week later, they actually released the first preview. So this was early 2018, I think this would have been at this point.
Yeah.
And they released the first preview and I was just all over it. And a lot of the initial Blazor community was all focused in a Gitter channel at that point. So I remember having the Gitter app and I read every single message in the Blazor Gitter chat room for 2 years. I literally had a routine where I'd wake up in the morning and I'd scroll back to where I was when I went to bed because I'd read everything up to the point I went to bed, and then I'd read everything that happened overnight and all the way through the day. And I did that for nearly 2 years. I just couldn't get enough of it. It was just an instant passion. And it was right around the time I wanted to start a blog because I'd wanted to sort of give back a bit, really, because I read so many great blogs over the years that had really helped my career as a developer. And I was like, well, I'm getting pretty senior in my career now. I should be in a position that I can feedback. And to be honest with you, looking at it now, I don't think anyone should think that you should only blog if you're senior, because I think there's lots of stuff that anybody of any level can give. I mean, if you're just one step ahead of someone else, your knowledge is valuable to that person. I'd really encourage any developers of any levels of experience to chronicle their journey, whether that's YouTube videos or blogs or podcasts or whatever however they want to spread that around, because there's always something someone can learn from it. But for me at that time, I was trying to find a subject and I was doing general .NET posts a bit. And then I wrote this post called "What is Blazor and why is it so exciting?" And it flew out of my fingers. I've never considered myself much of a writer at all, but it was like a 2,000 word blog post, and I literally banged the whole thing out in like 25 minutes. It was crazy, and it just flew, and it was good. And then I posted it, and lots of people sort of were commenting and asking about it, and that was it for me. Then I think I blogged every week for, I think, again, about 2 years or so. And that led to all kinds of great opportunities for me. As you mentioned at the start, I got approached by Visual Studio Magazine initially, and I did some articles for them. I've written quite a few blog posts for Telerik's blog. And then I also got approached by StackOverflow, and I've done some stuff for them as well. So that was all really amazing. Yeah. And then the book and everything else, it just all kind of spawned from there. But that's kind of the journey that led me up to it, really. Yeah, it's quite nuts. I kind of can't really believe I still can't really believe it happened. It's really weird. But when the right thing comes along, I think it just grabs you.
Right. And then Microsoft gave you a MVP award in, what was it, 2019 or somewhere around there? Yeah,
2019. Yeah, that was like the most surreal moment in the world. So I can find it. I'll give it a kudos here. So Ed Charbonneau, who's a developer advocate at Progress, he was very active in Blazor early on as well, and me and him would chat a lot in this Gitter chat room. And I remember around the time of the MVP summit, I think it would have been 2018 probably. He pinged me and said, "Are you coming to Summit? It'd be great to meet face to face." And I wrote back, I was like, "Do you think I'm an MVP?" And he's like, "Yeah." I was like, "No, I'm not." He's like, "I'm going to fix that." And and he nominated me for an MVP award. And then, I did all the bits you do. And then I think about 8 or 9 months later, I remember I was at the bottom of the stairs with my wife after a day at work, and the email came pinging into my inbox. I literally just looked at my phone really blasé, and I dropped it on the floor, and she went, "Are you all right?" And I was like, "They've given me an MVP." And then I jumped around like a giddy child in the hallway for a little while, and then after I calmed down from that, I kind of could get on with life after that. So yeah, no, that was amazing and stuff. So yeah, that was cool.
Well deserved, because Microsoft's goal with that program is to recognize and shine a light on experts in the Microsoft space. And how do you know an expert? It's because they're teaching. So you look at the people who are teaching, guess what? They're the experts.
Yes, yeah, it's very true, and I've learned so much from other MVPs over the years, and it's still weird. Even though I think I'm in my 4th year now, and I'm still like, it is still a bit surreal when I think about it. But it's a nice accolade to have. I appreciate the recognition.
Yeah, well deserved.
So, yeah.
And you're still doing it. Well, let's jump into Blazor. What is it about? And we're going to assume that the listeners, because we've covered Blazor in so many different forms of fashion, they know what it is and they've probably played around with it a little bit. But in its recent incarnation, how do you think about Blazor? If you're going to create a new Blazor application, are there some defaults that you go to where, oh yeah, most of the time you want to do this, unless you have a specific reason to do otherwise? The big server side versus WebAssembly and different choices. What are your go-to decisions? Like, okay, it used to be a choice, but now, yeah, I really do think 80% of the time you want to do this.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good question. So I'm going to try and just avoid being the classic developer and saying it depends, because that would, that'd be cheesy. If I'm doing something that is something I want to build out quite quickly, I'm doing some prototypey work, proof of concept stuff, things like that, my go-to is Blazor Server, because I just think there's nothing more productive than that framework. It's the thing that rivals probably the WinForms, WebForms application model in terms of productivity. You can build things very fast because everything's on the server. I haven't got to worry about separate APIs and all this kind of thing. So I'll use Blazor Server for a lot of that kind of stuff. If I'm doing something that's probably more going into production, that's going to be sort of more general usage and things, I tend to go to Blazor WebAssembly for those, because while I really like the productivity side of Blazor Server, I very often can't get past that trade-off of that constant connection, that uninterruptible connection with the server, purely because it's such a jarring experience for the user when you do get a little blip. And once you get to scale with Blazor Server, you've then got other things that you've got to consider. You've got to start thinking about how much server resource you've got, the memory usage, the performance, the state management side of things. And I don't mean that from an application standpoint. I mean, like, literally, you've got a client server paradigm, and you've got this server that's holding state for all these various clients. And if I want to scale that, I've now got to think about, well, making sure that all requests come back to the right instance. And there's just things that I have to think a lot about there, which I don't have to think about if I'm using a WebAssembly approach.
Yeah.
Obviously, the trade-off with WebAssembly approach is I've got to deal with a slightly bigger download for the initial load. But for me, it's an initial load. It's a one-off cost. It's going to get cached. After that, you're going to get a very speedy startup. And to me, most of the time, that trade-off is worthwhile. Certainly for the applications that I've built and for the companies I've worked for have built, that's been the right trade-off. And then we've got that stability of a client-side application, and we get flexibility with being able to do PWA and all that kind of thing. So that tends to be how I reason about the two hosting models. So yeah, I think thanks for the answers.
So with WebAssembly, the template right out of the box, you have the weather forecast web API that you call back to the web service and whatnot, and it's just kind of vanilla. Are there any things that you add immediately? Do you want to keep those web service endpoints private to just your WebAssembly application, or what do you tend to think about as a default? Or do you leave it literally like the Visual Studio template has it, or do you immediately add a few things on?
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery.
ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
So I've got pretty strong opinions about this. So I've got a very specific way I build applications in Blazor. I've used this architecture across 3 different companies now, and it's worked in every single one, and they've all had 3 different sets of problems to solve. So it's worked very well from that perspective. And I've just joined a new company. I'm trying to wangle it in there as well. So we'll see. But what I like to use vertical slice approach to application design. I like to pair that up on the client side with Mediator. So I like to use a CQRS approach. So what I will do is I will basically gut the default template. I'm not a fan of dividing things by their type. I've been burnt in the past with experiences where this was back in my MVC days where, and I'm sure you might have some experience or some knowledge of this type of problem. You end up with an MVC app that gets very, very big. And what you end up with is a controller folder with an insane amount of controllers, a model with insane amount of models, and views with insane amount of views. And as a developer who's going to work on features, I've now got to jump through mental hoops trying to work out where all the dots join together across all of these different folders. When I actually got into Angular for the first time, that was where I encountered feature folders as an approach for organizing client-side applications. And I loved that immediately. I was like, I can go to a folder and everything I need for that feature is in that folder. And I haven't got to jump through all these this mental gymnastics. So for me, that as an organizational technique within the client side is great. But then if you then pair it with vertical slice as an overall architecture and feed that through to your API as well, it gives you this really nice development situation where as a developer, I come in, I've got, my feature folder. My feature folder contains everything that I need for that feature. Like that, I choose to use Mediator. You don't have to. You could use whatever you want to do to call your API. But again, I do like Mediator from that perspective. So I'll, if I'm going to load some data, I'll have a request through Mediator. I'll dispatch that request. The handler will call into the API. It will call to an endpoint that is specific for that feature, for returning that data. It's going to return the data in the shape that the UI needs it. And then I haven't got to worry about projecting that data back from the server into a new type that's sitting on the client. I can just use that shared model because again, one of our nice benefits of Blazor is I can just use a shared model between my client and my server. So that saves me having to jump through hoops. So it makes the whole experience very clean and tidy and kind of low ceremony, which I'm find the more teams I work with, the more that shines. The more complexity and abstraction you add in, the harder it is for new people to grok what's going on, and harder it becomes to make changes longer term because the abstractions can sometimes get in the way and things. So that tends to be my general approach. I like to use a BFF approach as well, where the front end API is tailored specifically for that application. So that's why that works well with that vertical slice. That vertical slice goes through my Blazor application back to its API, and then from that API, you've got lots of flexibility. I can then go and fan out to, say I've got a backing. My back end is multiple microservices. I can then go and call multiple microservices from that BFF. That's back end for front end. Sorry, I realized.
I was going to ask back end for front end.
Use an acronym there that I haven't explained, so apologies for that. So a back end for front end, just for anyone who's not heard the term before, is essentially having an API that is custom tailored for that client application. It's not there's a REST API or anything like that. It's designed to purely serve that front end application. Yeah, so I can do that. That means I can rearrange my microservices behind that API to my heart's content, because as long as the data model I return back to the client never changes, it doesn't matter where I get that data from. So it gives me a very flexible architecture going forward. I've got a lot of seams that I can adjust, and I think for me, good architecture, that's kind of one of the key goals of it, giving myself seams, giving myself wiggle room to make changes as applications grow and expand over time. So that's kind of my default way of building Blazor applications. And it, like I say, implemented this across 3 different companies now, and it's kind of worked pretty flawlessly across all of them.
Are there any, say, GitHub repositories that have samples either that you put or that you like that we should point people to?
So this is actually the way we build the app in my book.
Okay.
So in my book,
softball, right?
Yeah. So in my book, I've got a GitHub. There's a GitHub repository that goes with it. So it's an open one. You don't need the book to get access to it. You can just go on my GitHub and find it. It's a repo called Blazor In Action. And inside of there, that's how we build the sample app that goes with the book. So it's not quite a BFF scenario because we don't have any APIs behind the one that we're building. So in this scenario, the API just talks directly to the database and everything. But it is built in that vertical slice approach. There's an endpoint that goes with each feature. It uses Mediator to dispatch the requests, and it uses feature folders on the client. And you can see that go through the whole stack. So there's a feature folder in the client. There's a feature folder in the shared project, which contains the shared request, which have got all the shared models in them between the client and the server. And then the server has a endpoints folder, but that's got all of that, then has subfolders that match the features as well. So when you're in, this approach, like I mentioned, one of the good thing is if you're a new developer to a project, everything makes sense. You just follow the folder structure across the projects and everything kind of lines up. There's not too many moving parts and things. So it's worked well for me and the people I've worked with, and I've had pretty good feedback from it from developers. So yeah, that's how I go about it.
Okay. Yeah, we'll include a link to that in the show notes for sure. Now, one point follow up on how you tend to like to structure the web APIs. Do you lock them down from a security perspective in any way? Do you add things to it, or do you just leave those kind of how they work out of the box with ASP.NET?
So, I mean, it will depend what type of the application it is, but generally speaking, when I'm building an application that's either using a BFF, if I'm using a BFF in front of backend services, or even if it's just the one API and I'm just, building features specific for that application. One of the nice things about using the WebAssembly hosting model is that it's all same domain stuff. So cause isn't an issue here. So I don't have any cause set up, which means other apps can't really call into it because of cross-site anyway. And again, depending on what the requirements are of the application, if auth is a case, then I'll add obviously auth stuff in and things like that.
I think that's a key point that you just mentioned, because just maybe your experience is different, but I've come across so many developers that have that project, but then they need to make a web service for somebody else. So they add a web API controller, and then, I need to let them call it. So then they add in the core's capability, but then that kind of opens up anything that's in that project. Sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, do you segment different projects, web services for the WebAssembly versus web services maybe for a different application?
Exactly right. The way I approach this is that API is for that client application, and that's how I build it. And then if I'm building a public API, that would be a separate API. It's got,
separate
in my
project.
opinion, so a separate project, and it would run independent, because, like I say, because I'm building in verticals, my endpoints aren't general. They're not REST endpoints. They are, if I want, so in the application in the book, we'll use that as an example. It's getting hiking trails. Okay. So when it returns the data for a hiking trail for the list screen, it returns the data that list screen provides. It's not necessarily all the data that's part of a trail. It's specifically tailored to what that screen displays.
Yeah.
Now, if I were making this a public API, I wouldn't want to cut that data down, because if my consumer wants all the data so that they can decide what they want to render or not. And that, to me, is where the difference comes in. If I'm going to build a general purpose API for any consumer to consume data within my application or my platform, I will build it with different conventions. I'm going to build something, probably like following a REST convention or something similar to REST, where you can get access to all the data and follow the hierarchies and all of that kind of stuff. And you're not going to get an opinionated view of the data. You're just going to get the data that you're allowed access to in its entirety. When I build that web API that's serving a Blazor application, that is there to get data and respond to calls from that application only. And I don't mix the two.
Yeah. For those APIs, you don't even care that it's HTTP or text or JSON. Heck, if Microsoft, when they embed gRPC at some point or another binary protocol, and it's just a configuration key, you would just as easy select that, because all you need is some sort of remoting endpoint to hop over through firewalls and get to your server.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the point is on my if I'm using Blazor WebAssembly, I cannot go and access my data directly because I'm running on a client and it's over there on a server, and I need some form of interface to allow me to get to that data, and that is an API.
Yeah.
And as you quite rightly said, whatever the protocol that API is using is irrelevant because it's only between that API and that client.
Mm-hmm.
So
you control both ends.
Exactly. Yeah. And then, if I've got a public API and my app API, I can scale them independently depending on where the major usage is. If I've got a public API, I've got other things to think about, like rate limiting, request limiting, all these types of things. And they're not things that I'm necessarily going to be as concerned about for my client application and my client API. Yeah.
Now, some of these problems running client applications, they've been solved in decades past with all the WinForms and WPF applications, because we now have a process that's running on the user's computer. So let's talk about logging and telemetry. And of course, there's so much knowledge of how to do it when you're running everything on your servers or in the cloud. What's your go-to? Like when you do a new application, even before you think about what this thing does, you say, okay, I need some basic telemetry here. How do you think about that, and what do you put in right from the get-go for your WebAssembly processes, and how do you gather it up?
Yeah. So I've pretty much exclusively used Application Insights up till now. Application Insights works well with Blazor. There isn't actually a native Blazor package for it. What I've used is the JavaScript library version of Application Insights. Yeah, I've put that in. I've wrapped it with some C# APIs and collected data that way. I've also tried, there are a couple of community packages that have already done that work at wrapping the APIs more extensively. Did actually use that at my previous company, and that worked really, really well as well. And that's actually quite nice because now I haven't got to do a lot of the heavy lifting. It's all done for me. I can just install a NuGet package, define a key in the right place, and off I go. Which is great, and that works really, really well. Application Insights on Azure, if you're running on Azure, is brilliant because you can collect all kinds of data. You can create custom events and track those. So for the applications I've been building, that's worked really well for me, and I haven't needed to go anywhere else. Outside of that, with logging and that kind of thing, again, I can route all my logs through Application Insights, so that works well. So I can just use it to collect everything that I need to keep a check on the health of my application. So that's worked really well for me. I know there's some other bits out there in the wild that people are experimenting with and trying out for collecting telemetry and metrics and bits and bobs, but I've not had firsthand experience of those purely because I haven't really needed to, because Application Insights has just worked so well. And I really love in Application Insights that graphical view where you can look at all of the components of your platform and look at the requests between them and sort of see where the errors are or slowdowns and all that kind of stuff. It's a great tool. It's worked really well for me.
Yeah, nice. Now, let me ask you about logins, because again, that goes back to we did logins differently in thick client or smart client applications versus all the, a gajillion redirects that are kind of the normal web authentication now. What's your favorite? You have a WebAssembly application. What's your favorite method of just putting together that login screen, that authentication flow?
So this is a really good question. I think I'm about to change, actually.
Okay.
So in the book, it's always, and I've done this basically with everything else, it's been JWT based auth. So it's been
JSON Web Tokens.
JSON Web Tokens, yeah. So it's kind of your classic SPA stuff. You're going to go off to some kind of OAuth provider, so I've used Auth0, for example. So I'll go to Auth0, get redirected to wherever, or sign in with a username and password that Auth0 manage. And then I get redirected back to my application with a token, and then my app can call an endpoint with that token and get my other token back. And it's convoluted at the end of the day. Let's face facts. Auth is not a nice experience. at all.
So let's just detail. So
yeah.
the login form before you redirect to Auth0, do you have that form a WebAssembly page, or do you have that just a regular HTML page?
It's a good question. So if I'm using something like Auth0, then it won't be in the Blazor app. So what will happen is you'll go to you'll click on a link that says login. That will go to a component that doesn't have a UI. It will just do a redirect to the OAuth provider. So in this case, Auth0.
Mm-hmm.
So it'd forward me to Auth0. Then you're on Auth0 servers.
Yeah, they render the form.
They're gonna render the form. You log in there, and then they come back to the application, and like I say, we do the dance of submitting codes for tokens and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah,
I've done a blog post a long time ago, and it's probably still one of the most popular ones, where I actually took the identity stuff that is generated with the scaffolding in like Visual Studio or whatever, and I actually redid it all as Blazor components. So it's kind of a bugbear. It's something that people have been asking for a lot with Blazor, which is, we've got all these things that are scaffolded as Razor pages. Why can't we have these as components? Because I have to swap out of Blazor to go to Razor pages and back again. And I think I'm right in saying that the reason for that is purely a resource thing. All that UI is already built using Razor pages, and frankly, it does work. So, like everyone else, all of us other developers, Microsoft have the same constraints. They've got to justify the work, and it's hard to justify to go and rewrite stuff that works in a different programming style, just because, especially when those two things interop so well. So I believe that's the reason that we haven't seen that change happen. Whether that will be changing soon is a different story with .NET 8 or .NET 9 maybe. We'll see what happens. I think there's been murmurs of it. But basically all I did was scaffold those pages out, looked at the code that was going on behind them, and then all I did was create Razor components and basically essentially copy and pasted the logic. Tweaked it slightly, but essentially copy and pasted that logic, and now I've got it as components. So if I was going to use Identity Server and have a local identity server, then I'd probably do that same process. I'd have that in a Razor component and collect that there. Generally speaking, personally, when it comes to authentication and certainly username and passwords, I do everything humanly possible to not have to have responsibility for those things. So wherever I can, I would always use a third-party provider, whether that's Auth0, whether that's Azure AD, Azure B2C, Azure B2B, whatever that happens to be. Just get it off of your estate, because they're then responsible for securing those passwords and making sure that there's no security breaches. And sort of with Troy Hunt's Have I Been Pwned getting stronger and stronger every day, I do not want to appear on that at any point in time. So if I can farm that stuff out to experts whose only job is to do security, then I'll always do that. So I would very rarely use Identity Server if I could ever get away with it.
Right. Okay. Man, we could go on forever, and you've got just a ton of stuff in your book. So we should plug that. And should they go to Manning.com or Amazon, or what's the favorite?
Yeah, it's available on Manning.com, and it's available on Amazon as well. So you can go to either or. I'd say chances are it's always worth checking Manning first, because there tends to be more discounts at Manning. Right. So definitely go there first, check it out, and yeah. And
I don't want to overspeak, but I think Manning, for user group leaders, Manning is pretty good about sending free copies of a number of titles to support user groups. They still do that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think reach out to Manning if you're running those sorts of things, and they're usually happy to support with codes that give free books or heavily discounted or whatever. So yeah, that definitely do that. I'm just thinking, actually, I just want to have a look. Yeah, I have. In fact, I've got a 50% discount code for your listeners. So if
all
they
of
go
them,
to Manning,
or?
Yeah, so if you go to Manning.com and go to buy the book, when you check out, if you use the discount code PB Sainty, all one word, so you'll get a 50% discount. So I'll make sure you've got a copy of that, Jeffrey.
Is it PBSANITY?
PBSAINTY.
Okay. All right. We'll make sure to include that in the show notes for the listeners. Fantastic.
Pop it in our chat as well, so you've got a reference there. So yeah, that should get a 50% discount. as long as they not swap the code on me.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, man. There's a lot of good information. I learned something about Blazor that I didn't learn. So fantastic. And I know all the listeners are eager to go and grab your GitHub repository, and we'll include links in the show notes for everything else, to Chris's website and YouTube channel and his book, and certainly that discount code. So fantastic. Well, thanks for coming on and sharing with us about your escapades in Blazor.
Yeah, my pleasure. Anytime. I'll, as you probably guess, I'll talk about this all day long and all night.
Oh, it's easy. It's easy to, right? I mean, I'm a fan too, but yeah, you just
absolutely.
hot off of writing an entire book on the topic. So that's amazing. So, all right. Well, thanks so much.
No, thanks for having me. It's been awesome.
Oh, my pleasure. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.